Hello, my name is Mona Jones, and this is the most accurate AMC Interview with a Vampire discussion you've watched today so far, probably. Look, I don't know your life, and you've probably watched more big brain folks talk about the show, and now you just want to watch a ball bitch babble. Nevertheless, you're here, you're tuned in, so let's get into it. Um, Quick disclaimer though, I'm not an expert. I've watched the entire show twice now. I've read many of the Vampire Chronicles books, Interview with the Vampire Lestat, Queen of the Damned, Tale of the Body Thief, and Memnoch Devil. But I'm not here to say that my opinions or thoughts are the right ones or act like I understand the show in a way somebody else doesn't. Because that's the beauty of any piece of art, right? Especially like a visual one, is that it's up for interpretation. So when it comes to this show specifically, it's really up to the viewer to decide what they take away, who they like, don't like, which ships they support, don't support, etc., etc. All I can talk about is what I feel, what I think, and if you disagree, that's fine. That is okay by me. That being said, let's begin. So, quick rundown. AMC's Interview with a Vampire is the TV adaptation of Anne Rice's iconic 1976 novel, uh, the books that started her entire Vampire Chronicles adventure, brought to screen by many talented people of a huge, like, there's so many talented people that have brought this show to the screen, behind the camera, in front of the camera, handling the camera, costume design, music, actors, editing, writing, set design. I go on. Shout out to the PAs. Always a big shout out to the PAs, but it's all led by showrunner Roland Jones. So the show stars Jacob Anderson as Louis Point Locke, the titular vampire being interviewed by Daniel Malloy, who was played by Eric Bogosian. So the story bounces between the past in season one, that's New Orleans between roughly 1910 and like late 1930s. And in season two, that's a little bit of late 1930s or early 1940s Europe, like Romania, around that area, and then going into Paris. So we're going from the past to 2022 Dubai as Louis tells the story of how he got involved with the ne'er-do-well vampire Lestat de Liancourt, played by Sam Reed, and all the beautiful ups and terrible downs that followed when their love led them to parenting a forever 14-year-old named Claudia, played by Bailey Bass in season two, and Delaney Hales in, no, played by Bailey Bass in season one and Delaney Hales in season two. So there's a lot more to it. There's a lot more important players involved, but that's kind of like the bare bones basic. Got it? Good. So let's get into the meat of it. Also, obviously, big time spoiler alert. I'm not gonna go into like every nook and cranny of each episode, but watching different people react to the show, review the show, there's just some points that I haven't seen a lot of people talk about. Doesn't mean that nobody's talking about it. I just haven't seen it. So that's what I'm gonna focus on more than just like going, over every single thing that happens in every single episode. Um, but yeah, so if you have not watched the show, do not come at me about spoilers. Go to AMC for seasons one and two. Go to Netflix for season one. Ahoy, matey. You know what I mean? But that being said, now let's really get into it. So, um, season one, episode one, In Throes of Increasing Wonder, starts with Daniel at the beginning of an arc that will take him from the human world being his primary domain to the vampire world being his primary domain. He goes from seeing vampires mostly or only as monsters to being able to see the humanity within while still holding a very specifically Daniel shaped space in which he holds them accountable for being messy and toxic or whatever. So there's his there's the ambition that has driven him to because it's 2022. We're not at the peak of the pandemic, but the pandemic is still a thing, right? So the ambition that's taken him that put him on a plane from the United States to Dubai when he's older and he's got because he's like 74, I think. 70s, like early 70s. Um, so he's older, he's got an autoimmune disease, and he chances it because his career as a journalist has hit an all-time low, and this is like the big chance for him to respark it. But underneath that ambition is someone who is looking for answers while kind of also being under the impression that he already has them, right? Because in his last encounter with Louis, unknowingly with Armand as well, his body was put through a lot of trauma, like a lot of physical trauma. So his body remembers the trauma that Armand, played by Asit Zaman, put it through back in 1973. But because his mind only remembers dealing with Louis, I think he's looking at him as a predatory vampire, right? But he's also looking at him as basically a wealthy man who preyed on him when he was, to quote Louis, just another drug-addled homophile, which is a dated word for homosexual and kind of shows Louis' disconnection from like modern day lingo, which I think is a little not an Easter egg, but it's something that once you kind of know what's going on in the show, to hear him say that and to know, oh, okay, so Louis has been disconnected for a while. This is why he says that. I don't know, it's just interesting. So, but yeah, so Daniel spends a lot of season one very hostile and looking at Louis as a liar, as predator who might try to take advantage of him again, even as the unfolding of Louis' story starts to gain Daniel's sympathy. So a lot of people have rightfully, and I hope they continue doing this, talked about the racial injustices and limitations faced by Louis as a black man, but not so much about the advantages that he has as a Creole man in 1910 New Orleans. I mean, he's still a black man at the end of the day, and it shows in the challenges that he faces. But he has leverage in a way that a darker skinned black man, or especially a darker skinned black woman, doesn't have. And so he uses that little bit of leverage to his advantage. So Louis' work as the pimp of Storyville, which is basically the red light district of that time and place, puts him in a position of power. But he chose that line of work because he wouldn't have the same authority or make the same money in the types of work allowed to him as a black man. Limited choices in society, so Louis chooses to be a pimp, which helps him keep up his family in a big house with servants. So it's that like dichotomy. Love that word. I love that word, dichotomy and unbeknownst. Solid words. But anyway, um, it's the dichotomy of where he has power, where he lacks power, and how he navigates those two spaces as someone who is also secretly gay. So, a perfect example of that is how Louis goes from handling the situation between one of his girls and a white man to handling the situation between another one of his girls and his brother, who's a black man. So Louis is checking in with his employees. He's collecting that coin. When his right hand man, Finn, played by Jeff Pope, I'll be saying that a lot, kind of just to, I don't know, I like to put a spotlight on the people bringing these characters to the screen, the main cast as well, but also the supporting actors. Like we wouldn't have the show without them. We wouldn't have the stories that we have without them. So I just want to, shine a light on them personally. But yeah, so when um Louis' right-hand man Finn, played by Jeff Pope, alerts him to a situation between his top girl Bricktop, played by Dana Gurrier, and a sleazy politician named Alderman Fenwick, played by John DiMaggio. Um, Louis starts dealing with that, but then while he's dealing with that, like Finn leaves and then he comes back to alert him to another situation between Louis' brother Paul, played by Stephen G. Norfleet, and another one of his girls. So when dealing with the alderman, Louis gets called the N-word, hard R, and can't put his hands on the man, even though reminding him that he is the Louis Dupoint Dubloc does at least get him an apology. When dealing with Paul, Louis quickly escalates to violence. He grabs him, uh, pushes him, kicks him on the butt, and when Paul responds by punching Louis in the face, Louis then puts a knife to Paul's throat and threatens to bleed him like a cochon, which is French for pig. It's just very intense, very intense. So with Alderman, Louis still had to be subservient, right? He kind of had to play up that like, oh, he had to play up that role, even though he was able to use a little bit of advantage, a little bit of leverage to demand some respect. Um, with Paul, who he's also related to, I think that's kind of important, maybe a little bit. I think there's a few things happening. So I think there's genuine aggression on Louis' part. He's genuinely mad at Paul for bothering the girls. Um, but I think some of that aggression that he gives to Paul is the aggression that he couldn't give to Alderman without a capital P problem. But I think there's also a performative nature to the aggression that Louis shows, right? Like he's letting the others know y'all don't have to do anything about my brother. You don't have to do anything or say anything to him. I got him, right? Out of fear that if he comes off as looking too weak with Paul or looking too soft on Paul, that maybe somebody else might try to take it into their hands next time Paul comes around. I don't know. That's just I obviously the show doesn't say that outright, but that's my takeaway from it. So he's putting on a show for the people around him in a weird sort of way to protect Paul. Um, and then he's also performing that aggression to hide what we later come to know as the actual softness of Louis, while also giving others as little reason to suspect that he's gay. And also at the end of the day, like he's a pimp. He has a reputation to uphold as someone that other people should fear pissing off. Um, so there's the genuine anger, there's the performative nature of the anger. Um, and in a weird way, it kind of reminds me of Armand later on with the Paris Coven, right? Where like Louis being in charge isn't necessarily a given. It is something that could be taken away from him. So in reminding people that, that he can be aggressive, that he would even be that aggressive with his brother, kind of like keeps everybody else in line in a way. Again, some of this is my speculation, but that's what I get from that scene, especially looking back on it after having watched the show a couple times. So, um, um, Louis' violence against his brother catches the eye of Lestat. They meet officially at the Fair Play Saloon, which is like a high-end brothel, predominantly um, white owned at this time. Um, but it's not until Lestat shows Louis his tricks at a poker game Louis plays with Alderman Tom Anderson, played by Chris Stack, and other affluent white men in the area that the two, Louis and Lestat, go from enemies to business partners to friends. So over the next few months, like literally months, we see them growing closer. Louis even comes to see Lestat as the only other person other than Paul with whom he feels comfortable opening up. Lestat grows to love Louis with a listening ear. He's patient. He shows up. He meets Louis halfway. At the same time, though, he's got an advantage on Louis that creates a power imbalance between them. Still, there is some give and take. Louis helps Lestat update his wardrobe by buy capes. Lestat takes Louis to the opera, one in which Louis doesn't have to pretend to be Lestat's servant and where he can sit down while the lights are still up. I will be bringing that up again because that's an important factor. Um, Unfortunately, we do get Paul taking himself out. Um, and so that leads that happening, uh, their mom blaming Louis, him losing so much of his like familial support system in such a short time really wrecks him. And then at the same time, after Lestat and him have sex, um, Lestat goes from patiently biding his time to get Louis to become his get Louis to become his companion to like rushing everything. So while Louis is distressed, Lestat is like really getting into his head, really reeling him in. And so we get um a very gothic horror romance moment after Lestat having followed Louis to the church, um, where Jacob Anderson gives a stellar performance with Louis's confession to a priest. Lestat follows him to the church. He kills the priest that Louis was confessing to, kills another priest, and then Lestat, covered in blood, asking Louis to be his companion. Louis nodding his beautiful head and literally licking into Lestat's mouth, which is still full of priest blood, mind you. Um, and saying yes, and then basically having this like unholy matrimony marriage moment in front of Jesus on the cross and all the saints. I love it. I personally love it. Um, Side note, Roland Jones and Sam Reed have both asserted that Lestat didn't have anything to do with Paul ending himself. I believe them. It's still kind of a touchy convo within the fandom. That's just where I stand. So, um, as of season one, episode two, after the phantoms of your former self, Armand is still pretending to be Rashid as he lurks around in the background, which is kind of creepy in retrospect, right? It allows Daniel to low-key flirt with him while trying to get information on Louis, but looking back while knowing the whole truth, it's a great example of how I feel like performance is a concept that pops up constantly, at least with my interpretation of things happening within the show. But it's a great example of how Armand performs subservience, right? Where he like lets Louis think that Louis has more control than he actually does. And so then going back into the flashback, we see Lestat is losing patience with Louis. He's becoming less and less willing to meet Louis halfway. That power imbalance that was already between them shifts as Lestat tries to mold Louis, not even into the image of who Lestat is, but into the image of who Lestat so desperately wants himself to be, which is where he we get his performance. He performs, he being someone who um sorry, I'm having some technical issues. What's happening? Anyway, uh, he performs being someone who What in the world is going on here? There we go. Sorry. Lestat performs being someone who can kill without care, who doesn't think too deeply about anything, and can just go through life without worries. So he's trying to mold Louis into being that person. But the more Louis pushes back against that molding, the more hostile Lestat becomes. He lets Louis run outside in the daytime. The more hostile he becomes, but there is still a softness there at times because Lestat legit loves Louis. So it's like we kind of see the weird back and forth way that he cares for him, right? Like he lets Louis run outside in the daytime to go visit family, um, but also to learn the hard way what the sun does to vampires. When Louis runs back to Rue Royale, the home that before they'd even gotten together, Lestat got for them both, designed with Louis in mind. When Louis runs back to Royale, banging on the door for re-entry, Lestat kind of takes his sweet time letting him back in. But once he lets him back in, he carries him up the stairs. He shows softness to him, doesn't apologize, and then tries to kind of smooth the whole thing over with basically like a subtle but not so subtle offer of sex. So later on, Louis almost eats his nephew, which is a very that whole "did you eat the baby" moment. It's like it's very dark humor. Um, sorry, Louis. But Louis almost eats his nephew. Lestat gently wipes his tears and reassures him that he's a good person. Then he turns around and pulls out two suits so they can go to an opera house, at which Louis has to pretend to be Lestat's servant. Like he can't even sit down in their booth until the lights go down. So while Lestat starts taking him to this opera house, when the other opera house is still an option, where Louis doesn't have to do up that whole performance, I don't get it. Um, but it feels like a control thing. It feels like but it also just feels like, again, Lestat is performing so much of who he wants himself to be, and he's sometimes putting that performance over his own needs and Louis's needs. He's prioritizing the performance of who he thinks he should be, trying to get Louis to be that, and in the process, he's completely ignoring what they actually need from each other. Like it's yeah, it's frustrating. It's definitely frustrating. Like okay, yeah, like we get Louis gazing lovingly at Lestat as he nerds out over the music. It's one of my favorite Lestat moments. Lestat being the fandom name for this couple. It's one of my favorite Lestat moments of the show. Them touching pinkies. Ugh, romance. It's romance. It's literally romance. But the circumstances around it, again, especially when episode one showed them at an opera where Louis didn't have to go through such a humiliating act, really spells big bad drama for the future of their relationship. Uh, so two things come to a head in season one, episode three. Is my very nature that of the devil? Louis realizes the futility of two different relationships and lashes out. So he realizes that some of the promises that made on the altar about how becoming a vampire would make the world his oyster. He starts to realize that some of those promises were kind of empty. So he punishes the stat with the threat of loneliness. Louis also realizes that playing subservient to men like Alderman was never going to give him the leg up he'd been hoping for. So he punishes Alderman with death and uses his body as a message to other affluent white men. Um, Full circle moment, because that's the end of the episode. In the beginning, Louis talks to Lestat about how slaveholders would do the same with enslaved people who tried to run away. Like they would punish them with violence, but they would also post their body up in a way to send messages to other folks that don't do that. So Louis says that about, what was happening, and then we end the episode with him basically doing the same thing with Alderman. Uses violence against him. One of my favorite moments of the show. I love Louis getting at Alderman. Love it. Um, what does that say about me? Well, let's not get into that. Let's pump the brakes on that. But yeah, so then we, see him doing the same thing at the end of the episode, which I think is a full circle moment that I really appreciate with the storytelling. So, except the difference between what one of the biggest differences between what the slaveholders did to enslaved Black folks back in the day, um, and what Louis ends up doing is that uh, white people in Louis' time retaliate in a way that enslaved Black folk could never get away with. And their rage creates a situation that leads to Louis bringing Claudia, played by Billy Bass, into his and Lestat's lives. Now, this might be kind of a controversial thing to say. Again, I am a Louis lover, first and foremost. But Louis's reasoning for getting Lestat to turn Claudia is very selfish toward both Lestat and Claudia. He pressures Lestat into parenthood that Lestat didn't even want because Louis needs Claudia around to affirm that Louis, that there's still good in him. However, I do get it. Like at this point, Louis, he's losing his family, he's losing his business, he's falling into severe depression. Lestat's love for him is turning into a cage. Lestat wants Louis all to himself, even as he started messing around with Antoinette, played by Maura Grace Atari. Lestat then has the nerve, because if Lestat has nothing else, baby, he's got nerve. He has the nerve to get mad when Louis has his moment with Jonah McCone, played by Thomas Anthony Olajide, I think is how you pronounce his last name, which I enjoyed and Louis deserved. Like if Lestat can go and mess around with Miss Antoinette, why shouldn't Louis get his? Why is that bad? Why is that wrong? But anyway, so, just Lestat at this point has not really been showing up for Louis. He's not supportive of Louis, who's struggling with his vampirism, even though Lestat is the one that turned him, making him his responsibility. Louis, he's lonely, he's floundering, and so he probably figured that the least Lestat could give him was the family that he'd always apparently secretly wanted. Um, but at the same time, Louis' pain leaves him without the capacity to stop and think about the consequences for Claudia. Lestat tries to tell him, but it doesn't get through the high amounts of distress Louis is feeling in that moment. It's just very messy. I don't think any one person is the villain in this moment, but it's a stage that's been set for disaster. They just don't know it yet. So at the same time, though, like what a wild experience for Lestat. Louis goes, "That's why you're always going to be alone." Does a Batman jump off the balcony? Comes home with a child Lestat has never seen before, with an offer of parenthood that they've never discussed. Like, girl, Louis, your mind works in strange and compelling ways. Never change, beloved. Never change. Side note, speaking of Antoinette, though, the scene where Louis first meets up with Jonah is interesting, and I feel like we're going to revisit it in the future because when the camera is like focused on has Louis and Jonah at the forefront, and we can kind of see behind them in a blurry way. There's an empty patio, and there's a distinctly Lestat-shaped person standing alone at the top of some stairs. But when the camera focuses in on Lestat, Suddenly Lestat is on the patio getting frisky with Antoinette. So I don't know what that means, but it feels significant. Go back, I swear. Camera focuses on Louis and Jonah. The background, that patio is empty. And there's a distinctly Lestat-esque person standing by himself at the top of the stairs. But when we zoom in on them, or when we zoom in on that setting, suddenly he's on the patio. So I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, so then Rashid, okay, Armand, all right, performer, okay, theater kid. Rashid gives Daniel access to Claudia's diaries in season one, episode four, the ruthless pursuit of blood with all of a child's demanding, which Daniel, then uses from that point as a reference while Louis is telling his life story. So Claudia coming into Louis and Lestat's life basically gives them a second honeymoon. It's all dancing around in circles in the courtyard of Rue Royale, buying Claudia her own coffin, celebrating her birthday, Lestat teaching Claudia to be a deadly predator who can drive, Louis teaching Claudia to be a gentle person who understands love, going to the movies to watch Nosferatu, going home, um, where Claudia and Louis giggle at Lestat doing a Nosferatu parody. Like it's all very cute. It's all very fun. And then they get the phone call that Louis' mother, Florence, played by Ray Dawn Chung, has died. So I do want to say Louis' sister Grace, played by Kayleen Coleman, gets a bad reputation in the fandom, at least on Twitter, like the interview with the vampire Twitter. But she was the one who encouraged Louis to invite Lestat to meet the family over dinner. She was welcoming to Louis after he'd been turned. She even encouraged him to bring Lestat around if it would allow her to spend more time with her brother. Like she still very clearly wanted a relationship with him, even like knowing about his romance with Lestat. Um, and then he left her baby crying on the floor. And then he kicked down the front door and scared her and her children half to death. So she's like understandably standoffish toward him at Florence's repast, which is then followed by Louis walking up on her and threatening her with a reminder of what he did to that door over their mother's dead body. So I don't think Grace has always made the best choices. And I think maybe there is some judgment from her towards Louis' family in that moment that feels really shady. But I also personally don't hate her or think that she deserved Louis coming at her like that. And I also don't think she deserves the some of the hate she gets from fandom. But I'm typically, and this is a bias, but like black women characters already there's so little understanding of what they do, why they do what they do, where they're coming from. So I tend to kind of over understand if that's even a thing. Um, so maybe she was shadier than I'm letting myself realize. Maybe there was some bitchiness coming through that I didn't pick up on, but I'm gonna give Grace some grace. That's just that on that. Um, when it comes to the stuff with Charlie, played by Xavier Mills, I think Claudia is bisexual. Her accidentally killing Charlie was literally the result of her being so in the moment that she lost control and her desire turned into a need to bite. The same way it does for Louis when he's with Jonah, only instead of biting herself like Louis does, she bites Charlie and goes overboard. Much respect for folks in the Claudia is a lesbian camp, though. I respect your vision. Side note, as I'm going over these, it's going to be a few side notes through these. As I'm going through the episodes and kind of like, going through the points that that I that stand out to me. I'm realizing how packed they are. Like there's so much going on from episode to episode, but I don't remember ever feeling overwhelmed. If anything, I left each episode wanting more and being excited for the next. So, um, again, unholy family honeymoon phase of sorts. The first 5 years in their lives, things are great. The cracks in Louis and Lestat's marriage have been nicely covered with the paint of what is basically a second honeymoon phase. Claudia was the bright spot in their lives when she was easy to handle. But when Claudia starts having her own wants, needs, issues, Louis and Lestat couldn't handle it, even though they brought her into this life. Worse, Lestat starts getting increasingly comfortable putting his hands on Claudia, um, grabbing her face, grabbing her arm, pushing her against her wardrobe, and just saying really nasty things to her, like calling her a mistake, saying she's built like a bird, telling her she'll never find love, throwing it in her face that she has nothing to do with his and Louis' relationship while he's literally in the middle of brutally assaulting his husband. I'm sure there's more I'm forgetting. Like her biggest op was a person who helped raise her. Nasty work. Nasty work. Um, one one can argue that Lestat forced Claudia to watch the body of her first love burn because he wanted her to witness it the way he hadn't been able to do with his first love. But nah, Lestat in that scene was just vicious. That was not a parent or teacher getting their child slash student through a difficult moment. That was him brutally reminding her of the suffering that she had in store for the future, as if she'd asked him to make her in the first place. Louis' absence in that moment is difficult. Like I get he's also in an increasingly abusive situation with Lestat, but at the same time, watching Claudia be so alone in that moment and forced to confront what were slowly becoming her biggest fears, that she would never find love, that she would always be alone. Um, that the cord that was tethering her to Louis Lestat in their home was slowly becoming more of a noose. Watching her be alone in that moment with those realizations is just hard to watch. It's just hard to watch. I wish she hadn't, if she had to go through it, I wish she'd at least had somebody by her side in that. So, um, Claudia ends up running away, like Wahoo wouldn't, in season one, episode five, A Vile Hunger for Your Hammering Heart, after going on a murder spree that left her with body parts all over her room. Girl's got hobbies. I'm not mad at it. She had a booby in the drawer. Okay, so she's a collector. Good for her. In 2022 Dubai, Louis tries to emphasize how much she was doing this from a place of hurt, but Daniel could care less. He literally compares her to Charles Manson. At this point, Daniel is still looking at the vampires and seeing monsters undeserving of compassion or empathy. Then go back to the past. After Lestat puts his hands on her once again and calls her a mistake. Actually, when I say he put his hands on her, this is the time that I was talking about. But yeah, him being that comfortable putting his hands on her and doing it in front of Louis, that's not a one-time thing. You build up to that, right? So, after Lestat puts his hands on her once again, calls her a mistake, she calls him out for still messing around with Antoinette and then leaves. She's had enough of basically fending for herself, of Lestat withholding information on vampires, of being lonely around a couple like Lestat, and so she's out of there. Side note, the way Claudia calls Lestat out on his continuing affair is so deliciously messy. She'd clearly been following him for some time, but instead of letting Louis know immediately, or like pulling him to the side, like, hey, like I followed him a few times, he's still messing around with that white girl. She throws it in Lestat and Louis's face to dig at Lestat. It's dramatic, it's jaw dropping. I live, hate it for my girl Louis, but I love it for me. Um, which leaves me, um, so she leaves, so she dips, she gets out of there. Um, for all those reasons, like the increasingly abusive relationship with Lestat, feeling so lonely, just needing to spread her wings. And so it leaves me disappointed and low-key kind of irritated with Louis for constantly calling out for her after she goes. Again, he's extremely lonely. By this point, Louis has like fully lost his family, community, businesses. His only potential source of support, who is Lestat, is still showing a casual disregard for what he's going through, and he's still messing around with Antoinette to, help with his own urges while also low key punishing Louis for being in pain in the first place. But Louis calling out for Claudia completely disregards why she left in the first place, and it puts her on the radar of Bruce, played by Damon DeNuno. Not that I'm saying that the abuse that she faces at Bruce's hand is Louis' fault. Absolutely not saying that. Not at all. But again, it's like another example of how he doesn't think about how his actions affect her. Um, as far as I'm concerned, I'm sure some people would say differently. The only time Daniel really steps out of line is when he's really weirdly insistent on trying to get the intimate details of Claudia's abuse. Um, Louis hits back by triggering a Parkinson's attack. I guess that's what you would call that. Daniel then retaliates by slapping Louis, but Daniel was in the wrong, like, period. Um, at the same time, this is kind of an equalizing moment for them. Louis sets a boundary and punishes Daniel for trying to overstep it. Daniel slaps Louis for reminding him of the very thing that's making it harder for him to do his job. Both having got their lick, they retreat to their metaphorical corners and then continue the interview. Um, Another Grace-related hot take. I don't blame her for saying goodbye to Louis the way she does. She's all but lost her big brother at this point, and she's grieving that the best way she can while also being forced into a position where she has to leave Nola. She's got to get out of there. Nola being New Orleans. Grace, again, is not perfect, but none of these characters are. I think it's funny when people will be like, oh, these characters are monsters. None of them are perfect. This, that, and the third, and have so much heat for Grace, not much understanding or care about the position she was put in, or whatever. Um, and I think, that moment, as heartbreaking as it was for Louis, it was just as heartbreaking for Grace. It had to have been like it's interesting because at the top of the season, when Louis is talking about people that he feels most comfortable opening up to, he names Paul and he names the staff. But we see him being just as comfortable with Miss Lily. We see him being almost just as comfortable with Grace. He just doesn't name them for some reason. But there is some comfort there. There is some uh love and like care in these relationships. And so to see Louis lose that sucks, but to see Grace lose that as well is also rough. Um, I know there's ultimately the season 2 version of the fight that we're supposed to take as what really happened, but I'm going to focus on the season 1 version because the way that Louis remembers it, or the way that we think it happens, is basically what drives Claudia and Louis forward with what they end up doing at the end of the season. So Claudia eventually comes home after coming to the conclusion that like Louis needs her as a sister instead of as a daughter. We get literally the sweetest hug ever between her and Louis. She, ironically enough, apologizes for her actions and how they affected Louis and Lestat. And I say ironically because Lestat in season one and then Armand in season two really try to push this idea that Claudia is going to lose her mind at some point. Like she's just going to be off the rails, won't be able to handle being a increasingly older vampire mentally whose body never reflects that change or that growth. So the fact that she's apologizing, holding herself accountable in a way that we don't see other vampires do, other vampires who are, whose bodies are older, who are supposedly less likely to lose it, it's just ironic. It's a very mature thing. It speaks to her growth, but sure, she's completely doomed and needs to be taken out, whatever. So she apologizes. Lestat rejects her apology because he's in his villain era and he's a wicked skank. I love Lestat, but this episode, him in this episode, him in the like following episodes, but mm, mm. So he rejects her apology and then he refuses her last desperate attempt to get him to open up about vampires. Um, when she is basically like, I'm through trying to play with this man. I'm through trying to get through to this man. Louis, let's get out of here. Lestat attacks her. Louis attacks him. Lestat proceeds to beat the ever-loving crap out of Louis before dragging him outside, draining him when Louis is already half fed, and then dropping him from the sky. It's brutal and heartbreaking, and no amount of trying to excuse us that will ever make me think of this as anything other than a heinous assault. I don't care if he knew Louis would survive. I don't, which actually, I think he explicitly says in season two, episode seven, that I don't know, I don't know if he said he didn't know or if he just didn't care, but regardless, I'm kind of more going off of things that I've heard some fans say. So I don't care if he knew Louis would survive. I don't care how many silent treatments Louis gave him or how many times he didn't say I love you. And it's not even just the physical stuff like the throwing or the hitting that Claudia got hurt trying to stop at some point. It's Lestat watching Louis fall, not lifting a finger to help him, and then going off to Algiers to cry into freaking Antoinette's bosom. Or maybe he didn't. I don't know where he went immediately after he left. And I don't care. Um, but he does end up in Algiers at some point, right? Instead of giving Louis some of his powerful blood to help nurse him back from the wounds that he inflicted, he just took off. So that being said, at the same time, I do still ship Lestat. I know, make that make sense. I know. Hear me out. Hear me out. Hear me out. Hey, hey, hear me out. Hear me out. Um, I remember feeling like, okay, I'm mad that Lestat just up and left, but also he needed to leave because I needed a break from seeing his face. Then as Louis starts to heal and some years go by, I'm like, okay, Louis needs his lick back in a major way. He needs to kill him, but like not permanent. Um, because I still think that their relationship could be salvaged. Maybe that's the bird in me. Some people completely jump ship, and I don't blame them at all. It was really hard to watch, and I'm saying that as someone who's never personally experienced DV but has seen it in real life. Um, but speaking of that, another thing that makes me able to continue shipping them is that these are fictional characters, which means that they are whatever the storytellers decide they are. I believe Lestat can change because the people creating his character could decide to change him while still making it believable to the audience, of course. But I think as it's like if you're dealing with somebody in real life and they're expecting changes from someone that aren't possible, one of the things you might say to them is, this is real life. This is not a TV show. This is not a movie. Y'all are not fictional characters. This is real life. Because in a fictional world with fictional characters, again, the characters are whatever the storytellers want them to be. As long as they make it believable to the audience, it can happen. So I still ship Lestat. But that's just me. That's just me. Me and many others, but that's just me. That being said, though, Lestat very undeservedly finesses his way back into Rue Royale about 6 years later in season one, episode six, Like Angels Put in Hell by God, after he records a song with Antoinette on background vocals. Like he records a song for Louis and he's got Antoinette on background vocals. That makes this leads to Louis swimming the Mississippi to go get Lestat from Antoinette's house. Um, sorry, I'm laughing because I'm thinking of the Alabama brawl, and that one person be like, "Was it that boy swimming his ass over there?" That was Louis swimming his ass over there to Algiers to get Lestat from Antoinette's house. They kick her out of her room to make up, probably very loudly, in her bed while she smokes and cries outside in a thin robe. Like, girl, where are your friends? Where are your Antoinette? Where are your friends? What is this? I don't care for her. Um, but if she had lit that place on fire, I wouldn't have. I'm just. They kicked her out of bed, kicked her out of her room to have sex in her bed, and probably did it very loudly, headboard thumping against it, with moaning. If she had set that place on fire, I would not have blamed her one bit. But then so prior to the Lestat shenanigans, though, the adultification of Claudia happens as she's actually becoming an adult. Like she cares for Louis as he's healing from Lestat's assault. She provides food for him, sets up a kind of like a vampiric physical therapy that involves Louis chasing around a goat. She keeps him occupied from his thoughts as much as possible. She cleans. She chases Lestat away when he comes knocking. Like, her mind ages beyond her body, and the way that we find out that Lestat had predicted when he before he first turned her, but she's too focused on Louis to think about it. So um we see that maturity in how she carries herself, how she talks, but we also see it in how her style changes. Because at this point, fashion is becoming the only way for her to really show the maturity that her body doesn't, which makes the whole situation with Baby Lou in season two even more messed up. But we'll get to that. Um, At this point, it's clear that Lestat's sense of ownership over Louis has come to include Claudia, even though he's growing increasingly just more and more resentful of her because of her relationship with Louis. He shows his true face, Lestat shows his true face when he snatches Claudia off the train that should have taken her to her freedom, then shows it again when he throws a tantrum, that big old tantrum, hollering and carrying on in French because she beat him at chess, even though he taught her how to play chess. So he should have been proud of her. Six anyway. Later on, he'll learn the hard way that he should have let her go, that he should have, in the iconic words of Tiffany Pollard, aka New York, just sat there and ate his food. So a lot has been said about season one, episode seven, The Thing Lay Still. So I'm not gonna do a huge dive into the murder plot. the Lestat dance and kiss. Romance. It's romance. Sorry. Louis' role and how it all goes wrong, and then the Armand reveal, where we find out that Rashid has been Armand all along. Um, Tom Anderson. I'm just gonna touch quickly on the things that really stand out to me in this episode. One being that Tom Anderson has been thinking way too deeply about Louis' relationship with Lestat. A framed photo in the top drawer of his office desk. Really, Tom? I wouldn't be surprised if it's sticky. I'm just saying. I'm just saying. It's kind of weird. It's kind of weird. Um, there's the gothic horror romance moment of Louis screaming and crying over Lestat's body like he wasn't the one who took a knife to it. You better work, bitch. Um, the irony of the situation, though, is that Louis uses the same knife on Lestat that he used against Paul, and that act of violence that got Lestat's attention. And then, so Louis and Lestat's first meeting, Lestat is like, again, Fair Play Saloon, predominantly white business. Lestat's like, how'd you get in the front door? Louis like, excuse me? So it's very antagonistic. And then it's them trying to outbid each other over who's gonna spend the night with Miss Lily, with Lestat emerging the winner. So in that moment, Louis like, I wanted to be him, but I also wanted to slit his throat. So then it's that. It's like he does the thing that he wanted to do when they first officially met. Again, very full circle moment. Love that how intentional the storytelling is with the show. And yeah, so with the Armand reveal comes the explanation for the floating bookshelves, and it's quite sinister. Turns out that Armand, being a 514-year-old vampire, can access the shelves with the cloud gift, but as we see throughout season two, he's not a big reader. Like we more often see him with the iPad doing what? I don't know, playing Minecraft maybe, who knows? Um, Meanwhile, Louis, who loves to read but does not have the cloud gift, is essentially put in a position to ask Armand for access to the books that should be easily available to him, right? It's controlling, it's weird, and that was my first sign that something was off in that relationship. Overall, love season one. That's really it. So then we get into season two. Episode one, What Can the Damned Really Say to the Damned? Which opens with Louis walking out hand in hand with Armand, like he's just come out to his grandpa. Now he wants to introduce his boyfriend. Their brand of romance, again, the concept of performative. Their brand of romance feels really performative. Um, I even make a note here, funny how the theme of performance keeps popping up in the show. And Daniel immediately calls BS, even as he low key kind of flirts with Armand, which I peeped more on the second rewatch than the first watch. But I see you, girl. I see you, Daniel. Um, people, a lot of people want to hold Louis accountable for a lot of things, some of which weren't his fault, weren't as bad as people make them out to be, or were a product of somebody else's behavior. It was like him responding to somebody else's messed up behavior. Um, but him assaulting Claudia, who at this point is being played by Delaney Hales, um, to protect Lestat's body really needs to be discussed outside of shipping terms. He attacked her when they were supposed to be united. He was supposed to leave a shelf in his heart for her and didn't. He let her down when she trusted him to hold her up, and not by her freaking throat. Instead, he turned on her when she needed him most. In the name of gothic horror romance, I lived for that moment, but also like the him, refusing to burn Lestat's body, him crying over Lestat's body. But everything else, the Tim grabbing Claudia, and just that the betrayal she must have felt, I hate that for her. I hate that for her. Um, sorry. Then there's the fact that Louis grieved for Lestat so deeply that he basically left Claudia doing most of the labor of taking care of both of them, at least from what we see, right? Like she was the one learning languages. On at least one occasion, she's the one who gets them fed. And on another, she's the one who protects them from an incoming air raid, which is it's kind of true to life when I think about the ways that um, Black men can often expect Black women to take care of them, but put in, on average, so not everyone, but on average, very little effort in doing the same. Lestat was an abusive parent, but he was still her parent. Her love for him turned sour because of how he treated her. But I'm sure having to kill Lestat hurt her too. Um, Unlike Louis, though, she can't afford to shut down or check out, no matter how much she maybe wants to. She has to keep going. She bears that responsibility, and I find that really unfair. So if we're gonna get on Louis about stuff, at least let's talk about that kind of thing, right? Like not just holding his feet to the fire for things that, again, either weren't his fault, weren't as bad as some people make it out to be, or was him responding to somebody else's messed up behavior. So Claudia and Louis come across a Romanian village. Claudia bullies a racist child, as she should, at them kids. Louis almost joins a throuple until one of them, Amelia, played by Stephanie Hayes, is killed by a revenant or a kind of like rabid vampire played by someone called the Halloween Dirk. When I first watched this episode, I was very confused as to why her fiance Morgan Ward, played by Blake Ritson, was begging Louis to help her after she'd been attacked. First, I was confused as to why he was looking to Louis to do something. But I think it's all about like their Western connections. Morgan being from the UK, Louis being from the US. I think Morgan looked at Louis as being like the only other rational person in the room because of that connection, because they both speak, variation of English as their first language. So, um, and then kind of shooting back to, so this is the flashback going back into 2022 Dubai. I should just say Dubai. It's a given. I think now that's it's 2022. Going back to Dubai, Louis has started to walk back some inconsistencies in his memory. And Daniel, and by proxy, the viewers, Daniel is often a stand-in for what some of the viewers might be thinking and feeling. Daniel starts to realize that some of the inconsistencies in Louis' story come less from him intentionally lying and more from him genuinely having like memory issues. Um, like watching Louis remember that Claudia could dream, even though in her diary she says she couldn't. So I'm thinking she just couldn't remember that she dreamed, memory being a monster and all that. Um, but Louis remembers seeing her dream. And that's a really emotional moment. Um, a really beautiful moment between him and Daniel as well. And then it's like it's cute. So when Louis is like really insistent on when he becomes aware of that and he's like, oh, like Daniel, we got to make sure we get the details correct. We want to tell the story correctly. It's cute in a sad way. I don't know, just like watching Louis um have that moment and be so sincere. Yeah. Anyway, so um Louis and it's the penthouse, the design of the penthouse is giving prison. But Louis and Armand's bedroom especially looks like a freaking prison cell, which is fitting, I guess. Like I mentioned earlier, the floating bookshelves leave Louis having to ask for access to books that he loves. He also has to ask for access to pages taken out of Claudia's diary. But even that comes with its own issues, right? Because Claudia's diaries were for her private thoughts and feelings. Yes, Louis is using them as a reference because his own memories are spotty. Yes, she was his daughter, sister. Yes, Claudia's diaries are the only way that she can exist authentically within the story and within the show. But does that make it right? It's debatable. Either way, Louis having to beg Armand for access to those pages when Armand is literally the reason she's dead in the first place is egregious, heinous, even. Disgusting, disgusting. Um, and then we end the episode with Louis giving Claudia the "you and me" speech as they head to Paris. Something else that's debatable is if he's only saying that to her or to the image of Dreamstat that he'd been seeing for quite some time, even at that point, which is why accuses him of carrying Lestat in his heart. So, was that just for Claudia? Was it for Dreamstat and Claudia? I don't know. Um, Daniel uh gives Armand the flirty eye in season two, episode two. Do you know what it means to be loved by death? Which is ironic given the title and their Devil's Minion Devil's Minion history that has yet to be revealed in the show. I'll go into that a little bit more for anyone who's unaware and would like to know more. Cute as this is, though, it does not distract me from the fact that Armand is trying to dictate how Louis talks about coming to Paris. Like, girl, like you were stalking from the shadows, but you were not having that experience. Let him talk about his experience for himself. Okay. Claudia and Madeline, played by Roxanne Duran, meet, and they pretty much immediately start nagging each other flirtatiously. I love it. Um, Louis' first meeting with Armand is a lot creepier than I initially thought. Armand introduces himself to Louis while he's cruising, which basically like French grinder part. Um, Armand reveals that he and the Coven had been stalking Claudia and Louis for like 6 months with their shared mind gift and with with the mind gift that they all have and no maker bond between anyone in the Coven and Louis or Claudia. The Coven had to have known that neither Claudia nor Louis knew to introduce themselves or that there were any other vampires to greet in the first place. But instead of saying something, they just followed them around all that time. So the music may be romantic. I see you, Daniel Hart. But that first Lumon, which is their uh, ship name in the fandom, the first Lumond meeting is low key kind of sinister. And you can see it on Louis' face how weird it is he is, how weirded out he is by the whole thing. So let's jump into so when Lestat first officially meets Armand in season two, episode three, No Pain, he gets the same treatment. Armand stalks him before showing his face, but where Armand waiting to invite Louis to join the coven, sorry, but where Armand waits to invite Louis to join the coven, he immediately invites Lestat. Like as soon as they have their face to face. Um, Maybe by the time he's met Louis, Armand has learned to reel it in a little. Mm. Meanwhile, back at the Vamp Cave in Dubai, Daniel and Armand are still angrily flirting. Then Armand tells Daniel about his first encounter with Lestat, and boy, are there some inconsistencies up in there. Also, some things that just like stand out to me as odd or messed up. So Armand talks about being intrigued by Lestat in a creepy way. In his flashback to what I think is like 1795 Paris, Armand's first thought, this is the first thought. He sees Lestat on stage. He's performing as Harley Quinn, as a Harley Quinn. He's up on stage. Lestat is up on stage. He's having a gay old time in all senses of the word. And Armand's first thought on seeing him happy and joyful on stage is, how do I get him under my thumb by any means? Which is weird, right? You see somebody you're attracted to having fun, and your first thought is, how can I control them? Like that's a red flag. That's a huge red flag. Um, and also one of the only consistent parts of Armand telling Daniel about his first meeting with Lestat. But I'm sure he um maybe thinks the same thing with later on with Louis and Claudia, that he's like, how do I get them under my control? So Armand says Lestat rejected each of his romantic advances before their official meetup, but when they actually come face to face in his flashback, I'm pretty sure Lestat only talks about having been stalked by Armand and not hit on by him. But then again, I, like Louis, don't have the best memory, so I could be wrong. Um, Armand goes on to show the viewers, to show Lestat, but also to the viewers, just how much stronger he is than Lestat at this point, which makes sense because Armand is like 287 years old, um, and Lestat's only like 34. Like he's still the age that he was when he was turned. Armand uses telekinesis while also using his mind gift to freeze everyone and their horses on the cobbled street that they're all standing on. And the only sign of strain is that his eyeballs start doing that weird shaky thing, which is important information to consider later on during the trial because it challenges the idea that Lestat could have fought even Armand alone, let alone taken on Armand and the entire Paris Coven. Um, Armand takes, so this is where we start to get like the more into the inconsistencies. Armand paints a picture of a Lestat getting bored of his boyfriend at the time, Nicolas de l'Enfant. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, aka Nikki, played by Joseph Potter. Um, that Lestat never really cared for Nikki in the first place. But even outside of having read the books, this doesn't make sense. When Lestat refuses to join his coven, Armand takes Nikki, knowing that taking Nikki will lure Lestat to them. Why would this work if Lestat found Nikki so easy to abandon? Right? Because at this point, Lestat don't mess with, he doesn't care for Armand, doesn't care for the coven. If he really didn't care for Nikki, why not just leave him? Right? Why not just cut his losses and head out? Instead, he goes to the coven, he gets his man, he gives a speech, he messes Armand's entire situation. Um, and so then, after the coven members have left and some of them have walked into the flame, which I did they do that on their own? I don't know. But after some of them have left, after they have all left, we get that scene of Armand and Lestat in the tunnels and them starting their relationship. So then later on, Armand talks about making out and having sex with Lestat in this like private-ish booth while watching the coven perform, which basically like the foundation of which will later become the Théâtre des Vampires. Um, Armand talks about Nikki looking up in jealousy and Lestat dismissing him and even like being like, oh, he needs to focus on his music. But this is the same Nikki, right? Whose music box Lestat holds on to through a century of sleep that he carries into the new world. and that he keeps even when he's living in Rue Royale with Louis. Like obviously, Lestat had deep love for Nikki to the point that many decades later, when Claudia throws Nikki's death in Lestat's face, it's because she knows it will hurt him, even all those years later. But I'm supposed to believe Lestat messed around on Nikki, then left him behind because he got bored. Sure, Jan. Sure, Jan. Um, Armand goes on to claim with Louis, who had been like asleep before, now showing up and supporting this idea that Lestat is only for Lestat. Basically calling him selfish, which he could be at times, selfish, self-centered. But it's also this is the same person, Lestat, that left Armand the theater and gave him access to enough money to keep the doors of that theater open for at least 100 years, even after the theater became started becoming less popular. This is the same person who stayed by Louis' side for better and for worse through 5 years of depression and grief. Granted, he was also still messing around with he was also still messing around with Antoinette, but he did stick around. Like if Lestat was really who they were saying he was, he'd have left Armand broke and dealing with the fallout of the theater losing popularity with absolutely no financial support. Them doors would have been shut. Okay? If Lestat really was who they were saying, he'd have left Louis as soon as their relationship stopped being fun for him. Instead, he stuck around so much that he turned into someone that Louis had to murder just to get away from. But Lestat is only for Lestat. I'm just saying, it's the inconsistency. Um, Yet another side note, I didn't notice this until I watched a TikTok from at Black Gay Comic Geek, whose content I highly recommend, where he talks about Armand's voice not being picked up by Daniel's recorder. We see it picking up Daniel's, like the camera literally kind of shows the screen where we see like the little lines going up as it catches a person's voice or doesn't catch their voice. Um, we see it picking up Daniel's voice as he speaks, but in the same shot, it does nothing while Armand speaks. So either the recording device has been hacked by Lestat, who doesn't want to hear his voice. Armand is baby on a level that like defies modern technology, or he's doing something to make sure he's not recorded. How or why, I don't know, but something is happening there. Because again, like the camera lingers with intention, but I also don't know what to think. So feel free to share your theories in the comments. Um, and then one more thing about this episode. So another another inconsistency comes more from what we see our mom do versus what he says. He paints this picture of himself as this like reluctant leader who's actually at the mercy of his followers, but he acts in a way that shows him reveling in his power. Like when he meets Lestat and later on Louis. He walks into Claudia's and Louis' apartment like he owns the place and forces Claudia to play by rules that should only apply when she's at work, at the theater, not when she's at home. He then gets on her for being late, even though she says she's always been on time. Like he's on a power trip, which is wild for someone who's constantly trying to make himself seem powerless. Even putting Claudia in the baby Lou role feels like him stripping her of power because it makes him feel more powerful. He tries to downplay his power and leadership, even in the moments of him getting ready to kill Louis after Louis has confessed what he did to Lestat while downplaying Claudia's role, even though Armand can see in his head knows that she played a part in it. A big part in it. It's like Armand wants to come off as meek, again, as a like reluctant leader, as someone looking to be guided. But he shows himself to revel in his strength and in his leadership when it suits him. Um, he only plays, the submissive role when it benefits him either in the moment or in some like long game that he's playing. I will say though, this comes from a place of unhealed trauma and pain because Armand has been through something. He's seen some things, he's had some things done to him, he's been through a lot. But the way he makes his wrongdoings everyone else's fault but his own it's an artful manipulation. So much so that some people watching the show miss it even when it's right in front of them. I missed it when I first watched the show. It was the second watch, and it's been, watching other people react to the show and talk about the show where I really started to go, oh, okay. And I would say it was the first watch, seeing other people's reactions, seeing people's like meta analysis and whatnot, and then going back for that second watch with those things in mind. Some I didn't agree with, some where I went, "Oh wow. Oh wow. Yeah, I'm seeing this now." Um yeah. So it's and I really want to watch this show again. This is my favorite show. This is my absolutely like, favorite show, I would say of all time at this point. I just love it so much. But I digress. I was initially speaking of meta and how it's influenced how I watch the show. Um, I was initially a lot more judgmental of how Louis responds to Claudia in season two, episode four. I want you more than anything in the world. But thanks to some great insight from many people, but like especially this one meta person, like meta, like uh, sorry, just majorly misgendered this person. He um does some really great meta analysis on Twitter. His name is Ash. He's at this red wine. Um, after hearing after reading some of his threads and seeing some of his thoughts, I've gained new perspective. Still, I do reserve some judgment for Louis, and I'll explain why. So, at this point, Louis's interactions with Dreamstat have become a lot more intense. He's talking to him out loud, he's spending time with him, and even goes so far as to hold the door open for him at some point. Um, Also, at the same time, Louis is rejecting Armand's request for him to join the coven and to become Armand's companion. But Louis is also using these interactions to gain favor from Armand on Claudia's behalf. So basically, he's hoping that by giving Armand the cookie, he can help himself, Louis, to a good time because he really is attracted to Armand. There's chemistry there. The actors have great chemistry. The characters, because of that, have great chemistry. Um, and Louis is genuinely attracted to Armand. Um, So he's looking to have a good time for himself, but he's also using those relations to keep Armand from having Claudia killed. So this double layer aspect of their relationship plays out in other areas as well. When Armand gets on Claudia for um, being tired of doing the baby Lou thing, which like you're mad at her for being tired with this tired ass play, whatever. Louis is silent because his resentment has him feeling like she's brought this on herself by moving closer to the coven and away from him. But he's also silent because he doesn't want to upset the balance that he has with Armand that's keeping him satisfied enough with Louis to not kill Claudia. When Claudia tells Louis that Armand put his hands on her behind the secret and threatened her, Louis responds that that doesn't sound like him. So part of him doesn't want to believe that giving Armand the cookie wasn't enough to stop him from being a threat to Claudia. But a bigger part of him realizes that he has to end his 2 year relationship with Dreamstat. Yeah, girl, you heard right. At this point, he's been in basically a 2 year relationship with a hallucination of his half dead ex. Yeah, yeah. So he realizes that he has to end that and devote himself to becoming Armand's companion if he wants to continue keeping Claudia safe. So I understand the position that Louis is in. And again, I feel for him. Like he even goes back into that hardened persona that we see him um, using Enola before he's turned in order to protect himself from doing something that he doesn't want to do in the first place. And in this instance, it's getting into a companionship, getting into another companionship with a powerful and controlling vampire. But I also reserve the right to judge Louis for how his actions make Claudia feel. So aside from Madeline, she feels alone. She thinks Louis has already taken Armand as his companion and chosen Armand over her, chose another one over me. She maybe even feels like if he's, if I'm right and he's feeling some type of resentment towards her, she's probably feeling that too. The coven that she thought would be a family for her has basically shut her out. She's getting like more and more hostile vibes from Armand. So it's like it comes to a point where her messed up situation starts to clash with Louis' messed up situation and leaves them at odds with each other when they both need each other the most. In a weird way, it's like Lestat's villain era united them, but Armand's villain era is tearing them apart. And also, I mean, we can't forget that Armand is actively like manipulating situations. And he is a master manipulator who at this point, I think he's like, because he was 287 when he met um Lestat, and it's been like 100 years. So he's like damn near 400 years old with centuries, not just decades, but centuries of like learning how to manipulate people. So that has to be factored into how things play out. Um, it's funny because I take a note. I'm like going into it, kind of what I just said. Also, Armand shows just how powerful he is when he puts the coven to sleep, minus Santiago, played by Ben Daniels. Um, while he also puts the rest of the restaurant on pause and is mentally telling Louis to come back after he storms off. Speaking of which, that whole Louis running up on Santiago, grabbing him by his tongue, calling him buffoon, like really being like, okay, you've been poking at me all night. I'm trying to talk to my sister about photography and art and we're having a good time and you're bothering me. So now that I'm here, what's good? Um, that whole situation, I wonder if that was Claudia's first peek at Louis the Pimp Duloc, which then, like thinking of that, makes me wonder if she'd ever heard of him when she was a child in NOLA, because like she had experienced abuse at the hands of adults, in a way that some adults tend to blame a child for instead of blaming the adult. So I could see people in her life threatening her with like becoming one of the Duloc girls or being sent to Storyville or the Fair Play Saloon or the Azalea as punishment for being fast. I got to see that kind of conversation playing out. I don't know, but it's interesting to think if she had maybe heard of him via his reputation and then seen what she had been warned about play out in front of her for the first time since she's come into Louis' life. So just food for thought. I'm tearing this water up. Because I'm doing a lot of talking. Uh, Daniel finally gets the answers to what happened to him in 1973 in Season 2, episode 5, Don't Be Afraid, just start the tape. So throughout the show, we've gotten indications that Louis is sometimes an unreliable narrator, which then, like, knowing that makes it easy to comb through the episodes to try to find incidents where things weren't relayed or things weren't told in complete truth, especially when it comes to scenes or moments that put a not so friendly light on his relationship with the stat. However, I stay away from this kind of like investigative work because it can get to a point of completely negating what Louis has to say about his own life and treating him like everything he says is a lie. Him being unreliable at times doesn't mean we can't trust anything he says. What what we can trust, or sorry, what we cannot trust, in fact, the show indicates to us using visual or audio cues, or it just has Daniel point out the inconsistency, since again, he's at times like a stand-in for the audience. Like when he calls BS on Louis, claiming that Claudia struggled to accept Lestat's death or that she was hesitant to burn his body. Like Daniel calls that out, right? Um, or what I think is the visual cue from season 1, episode 3, where Lestat shifts from standing alone by the stairs to getting frisky with Antoinette on the patio, depending on the camera's POV. Um, but one of the audio cues comes when Louis talks about how Armand, back in the day, could see that Louis was partial to Daniel, that Armand preserves Louis's happiness when even when he can't, and that Armand had a hunch that Daniel would prove fruitful in later time. Prove fruitful in later time. Each of those lines that he says is accompanied by like a musical cue, and it's like as if Daniel Hart himself is pointing to the line and going, "Did you catch that? Did you catch it? Hang on to that. It's important." And then you see why, because later on, Armand repeats those same lines, like word for word, bar for bar, with the same audio cues. So again, I try not to put too much guesswork into figuring out what really happened because I, one, trust the story to let me know, and two, I just don't want to question Louis like that. Because we could really fall down a rabbit hole. Did this really happen the way he said? Did this really happen? Is this the truth? Et cetera, et cetera. I'm gonna leave all that work to the show and the amazing people who bring it to my screen. BT Dubs, oh, I just said BT Dubs in 2025. Love that. Louis was an absolute menace to the queer community of 1973 San Francisco. I think they said it was like what 128 men that he brought back to his apartment, had sex with them, gave him drugs, and then he slurped them up, and not just in the fun way. My goodness. On a sadder note, though, Louis' you know what attempt is heartbreaking, and the way that Armand responds to it is quite frankly disgusting. Like, yeah, Louis throwing his childhood trauma in his face was messed up, fully uncalled for, even though I was living for like this big dramatic argument. Getting into an argument with your partner and throwing in their face that they were actually abused as a child is nasty work. But Armand punishing Louis for his attempt by putting him on the bed instead of in the coffin to heal faster, and then letting him sit there for what, like 5 days, 3 to 5 days, just laying there in pain, begging Armand to help him and getting nothing because Armand is too busy torturing Daniel. Yeah, Louis, Louis, Louis was not completely innocent in that argument, but the way that Armand treated him after that, that was foul. That was really foul. Um, so kind of dipping a little bit into the Devil's Minion. So basically, which is a chapter from the Queen of the Damned book, narrated by Lisette, I think. But yeah, that's basically what if you've seen the phrase Devil's Minion, that is what that refers to. So I hope Daniel checking out Armand's body mid torture, like those button leg shots. I saw it. Like, girl, Daniel, focus. Your life is in danger. Being tortured. Get it together. I hope that gave the DMers or the lovers of Devil's Minion and Daniel's relationship in the book with Armand something nice to nibble on. It definitely got me intrigued on where the show will take the ship, even as I'm still mad at Armand. But yeah, Devil's Minion is a wild ride of a romance in the Queen of the Damned book. In the Queen of the Damned book, for those of you who don't know, it starts with Daniel post interview with Louis trying to find Lestat to get him to turn him after Louis refused to do it. Only Daniel ends up running into Armand instead, and somehow that first meeting over time turns into Armand buying an entire island for them, like it's stalkers to lovers. Again, wild ride. I got into it in the book. Can't wait to see what that's going to look like on screen, but it cannot be immediate. I'm so sorry to the DMers out there, but it cannot be immediate. Daniel just helped Louis escape his abusive relationship with Armand. It is not going to be a good look if he's immediately trying to get in the draws of the person that he talks so much crap about. Because the worst thing Armand did to Louis was not lying about who saved him during the trial or keeping him from Lestat. Those were among bad things, for sure. But it was, you know, the psychological abuse that came after. It was the controlling behavior, putting putting the books of a known book lover like Louis on a shelf that he couldn't access on his own, making Louis have to ask for access to those books or to Claudia's belongings, ethical issues aside with the diaries. Um, like that was really messed up. It's the years worth of mind games that Armand played with Louis in order to keep him docile. The mind games that we kind of get a hint of throughout the interview, especially in season 2, after we find out, Armand's real identity. It's Armand having edited Louis' brain at will, um, and keeping Louis unknowingly tied to the person that murdered his daughter and his daughter-in-law. So, like, do I understand where Armand was coming from? Yes. And I can even empathize, like, with his fear of loneliness and his trauma and, like, what he's been through, like the horrible, horrible things that he's been through and the ways that he struggled. Like, he's a very complicated character with a messed up past. And I like that. I want more of it. I want more of him. But the hurt that he caused deserves consequences. And that's something that I can acknowledge while also still enjoying him. So I don't know how that relationship is going to play out in the future. I know they are definitely going to bring it to the screen though. Like I've seen those cutesy little interview moments with um Acid and Eric. It's out. It's coming. But yeah, that's it. Can't just be something immediate because again, Armand keeping Louis in the dark about the role he played in the trial, um, him editing Louis's mind, the manipulation, the gaslighting, like those are the worst things he did. In addition to just the role he played, the fact that he helped lynch Louis's daughter, that he organized that he directed it. So you know what I mean? It's gonna be complicated. I can't wait to see it. But yeah, anyway, let's move forward. So, season two, episode six, Like the Light by which, oh, this is a long title. Like the light by which God made the world before he made light. This episode cements Claudeline, their fandom ship name, Claudia and Madeline, as the healthiest relationship on the show. So naturally, they're doomed. Um, Armand Delier plays the victim, a role that at this point should have earned him an in-universe Oscar or some type of accolade, something, Golden Globes, something. Because, ooh, what a performance! That word again, performance. Um, at this point, Armand has already, and this is in the past in Paris, Armand has already started plotting against Louis, Claudia, and Madeline, which is wild. He's kissing on Louis while planning his lynching. He's sleeping in Claudia's coffin while planning her lynching. Madeline reassures him of what she thinks is Louis's love for him, while Armand is planning to throw her to the wolves with the option of forsaking Claudia for a place in the coven. So she at least gets that. Um, yeah, all while he's, pouting around Dubai and talking about himself as being so helpless. Again, the performative subservience, this performative submission, taking what, might actually be genuine feelings of sadness and regret and weaponizing them to protect himself from the consequences of his action. Also, I personally, I don't believe Armand when he says that Louis asked him to erase the memory of his attempt solely because Louis has depression and Catholic guilt. I mean, he still has like rocks in his ankles. There's no way he gives up a memory connected with so much pain, grief, and shame when he's so much in the business of holding himself accountable for some of his worst moments. So I don't really buy it, but I also at this point I don't really trust Armand. So it's easy to not buy it, but it'd be interesting if we find out in the future that that was true. So moving along, season two, episode seven, I could not prevent it. Oh, I'm yapping a lot. Call me Lestat, because I'm yapping a lot. Um, or call me Louie. Yappers. Two yappers in love. Season two, episode seven, I could not prevent it. Opens with the lynching, pretending to be a trial, pretending to be a performance, in which the actors, Claudia and Louis, have been put on trial for their crimes against Lestat, with Madeline just kind of there. Um, Lestat has some bruising on his hands, so possibly defensive wounds. He insinuates that Armand had something to do with Nikki going into the fire, and Lestat, points out his shared guilt and even suggests that he should be on trial as well. He apologizes, like genuinely this time, for that whole situation in season one, episode five. But until the show tells us otherwise, I'm holding Lestat at least partially responsible for being at the trial in the first place. Um, or no, I'm holding not partially. I'm holding Lestat responsible for being at that trial in the first place and for doing things like painting a picture of Louis being this scary black man who preyed on him um before they first got together, as if we don't have real footage of Lestat preying on Louis. And when at a time when Louis was at his lowest. So I'm not gonna act like Lestat orchestrated it because we know that he didn't. I'm not gonna act like there's no chance that he was there against his will because that is something that happens in the book. I don't know how that gets incorporated. Um, So again, until the show tells us otherwise, I do think he is at least responsible for showing up to the trial and for being in it, for being at rehearsals. That's where I stand with that. Some may disagree. That's fine. Um, Once again, the show does the work in showing us major inconsistencies and how Louis told the story. Um, and a couple of things that he talks about, so I don't have to play Inspector Gadget, which is a very dated reference, but I'm also almost 35, so whatever. We get the retelling of Louis getting Lestat to turn Claudia and of Louis's big fight with Lestat in season one, episode 5. So it turns out that Louis getting Lestat to turn Claudia was a lot more visceral and somehow even less about her. Louis doesn't realize this during the trial, so when Claudia asks if Lestat is telling the truth, Louis says no, but something about the face Claudia makes tells me that she doesn't really believe it. So we go into the flashback. Louis begging Lestat to turn Claudia is all about how he needs it because she called him an angel. He drags her on the floor. He makes desperate promises to Lestat about staying around forever and being whatever Lestat wants him to be, all from a place of despair and hopelessness. It's like an incidental manipulation done by someone who isn't trying to manipulate, but who's like desperately in need of support, and community and knows that their partner can't or won't give that to him. Like, yeah, we have seen of that dabbing Louis' tears that one time, but that does not make for a supportive partner. Lestat sticking around while also sticking his you know what and his mistress does not make for a supportive partner either. Lestat helping Louis buy the Fair Play Saloon and turning it into the Azalea doesn't make up for not supporting his husband emotionally. Lestat has the potential to be that supportive partner, absolutely. But by the time Louis is begging him to turn Claudia, Lestat has spent more time trying to mold Louis into what he wants him to be instead of meeting Louis where he is. So it's a big, it's like one piece of a larger pie of, what had Louis so desperate that night. And it's messed up. But again, I don't think that Louis was maliciously manipulating the stat, and his state of mind does need to be taken into account. But again, I am a Louis lover, so make of that what you will. And then we find out that the big fight from season one, episode 5, was more of a 1v1 than we were led to believe, which absolutely does not excuse us that dragging, draining him, and then dropping him from the sky. But it does feel good to know that, like, in this fight slash crash out situation that Louis started on Claudia's behalf after Lestat attacked her, Louis at least got his licks in. And a couple of jokes and laughs too. Good for him. Before Lestat fully lost control. It it sucks that Claudia never learns this. Even though it wouldn't have made a difference since she still ends up nursing in whatever version of the story, Claudia still ends up nursing Louis from the brink and hating Lestat for what she saw him do, which are the things that we see him do, which are the things that he then gives a heartfelt apology to Louis about, um, and admits that he didn't deserve the forgiveness or the mercy shown to him later on. It moves me to tears. It's the bird in me, whatever. And it moves Claudia right out of her seat. She asks if she too can cry and receive forgiveness. Naturally, the coven shuts her down and offers her nothing close to the grace or understanding received by the white man who held her captive, abused her, and treated her like trash not so long prior to the trial. Like all these things, this is not like the trial happens 20, 30 years later. This is like maybe 10 years removed from all, well, say we're going through Europe. So maybe like 10, 15 years prior, I would say. But it's not, in terms of vampire years, it's not that long. Um, yeah, it's not that long at all. So, Claudia dies holding Madeline as she burns, as her lover burns. She dies not knowing where they take Louis after he's ripped from her arms. She dies thinking Lestat helped orchestrate the trial and that Lestat was, sorry, was one of the many vampires messing with her and Louis's heads whenever they spoke, out of line. Um, but even then, she looks to Lestat in her final moments because he's all she has left of a family as she's reduced to ash, which is really tragic. And it's what Lestat has to carry for the rest of his existence. So, um, gets to the finale. Louis, Armand gets Louis out of the coffin. Louis goes off the rails in season 2, episode 8, and that's the end of it. There's nothing else. Am I bad for enjoying it? Probably so, but I don't care. Louis is usually so like put together, so calm, cool, and collected. So when he loses that cool, murdering the alderman, holding Santiago, holding Santiago's tongue, and calling him a buffoon, taking out the coven, I just love. I love seeing Louis lose that cool and really go off and be mean or really like, yeah, get into it with somebody. Ooh, I hope you didn't pick that up. Must have been growling. Somebody's hungry. Um, Anywho, one thing I noticed on second watch was that Sam says, so Armand is pretending to argue with Santiago. Um, like at this point in the episode, Daniel hasn't done the reveal yet. So we think that, oh, jeez, sorry, you can hear that. Um, Stomach is just a rumbling. So at this point in the episode, it uh, of the flashback, it seems like Santiago is putting up a performance, and Armand is genuinely arguing with him. Going back and looking at it again, they're all putting up a performance for Claudia. So when Sam says very convincing Meta, it seems like he says it to Santiago when you think that Armand isn't in on it, but actually Armand is in on it. So clearly he was saying that to him. So that was just an interesting little thing I caught going back to the episode. Um, Skipping forward a little bit. Uh, I have a lot to say about this episode. Wow. Okay. Uh, so having taken Lestat's struggle to save Louis, again, word for word, bar for bar, I assume that the punishment Armand says he received for saving Louis was actually given to Lestat. That Lestat was actually the one who gets dragged around, tossed into the rat box, and considering the level of guilt and shame Lestat would have been feeling by that point, I could see him letting them do it. But even if he hadn't let them do it, he'd have no way of fighting back against all of them or stopping them. So, um, when Armand so post revenge, when Louis has taken out the coven, and Armand takes Louis to get what he thinks is going to be revenge, or what Louis thinks is going to be revenge on Lestat. Lestat looks up, and it seems like he's looking at Louis and says something like, "Does it get tiring, destroying everything in your wake?" But I think he actually says that to Armand, which like which would make the most sense, right? Because why would he say it to Louis, who punished the coven for what they did to Claudia? We don't know how season three is going to portray Armand's history with Lestat, but we do know, right, that Armand in the show did have his coven torture Nikki, and that Lestat turned Nikki to save his life. Then there's the scene during the trial where Santiago mentions Nikki walking into the flame, and Lestat looks at Armand and says, with a little help from others. So we know that part of their story is canon in the show. And we also know about the previous coven that Armand destroyed some of the members of, the ones he acted like simply ran off and destroyed themselves, even though part of his role as a leader included punishing unruly vampires, which you would have considered them all for leaving. So, um, so then you have the vampires who have died by Armand's hand, members of his previous coven, Nikki, Claudia, Madeline, and almost Louis. So again, it makes more sense that Lestat would look at Armand and not Louis and ask if he ever gets tired of being at the center, being the cause of all this destruction. So, um, kind of going back to Dubai, Daniel brings up the moment that Lestat used his mind gift to get the soldiers out of Rue Royale in season one, episode three. Um, it's a reminder to the audience of how using his mind gift on that many people at once left Lestat bleeding from the ears and so like tired that he had to sit down. So when all of Daniel's questions lead to him revealing or helping Louis put together the pieces to figure out that Lestat saved Louis and not Armand, we see a flashback of Lestat at the trial in a similar situation. He's bleeding from the ears, he's very visibly tired, in addition to having those visible bruises on his hands, and his eyes are even more bloodshot than last time. So, one narrative I keep seeing among some viewers, especially Lestat haters, ironically enough, is that Lestat could have saved Claudia, and some even go so far as to say that he could have saved Madeline too. And it's like, y'all, Lestat is not that strong. He was damn near Superman compared to Claudia and Louis, especially when Louis wasn't eating well. But we've seen Armand lay Lestat out. We saw that in season two, episode three. So Lestat really stood no chance against Armand and the Coven. He couldn't have saved more than one person. And even if he could have, Armand and the Coven wouldn't have let him pull that same trick twice. So, Lestat chose to use that one chance he had on Louis. That's the burden he bears. But it was never going to be him saving them all, using his powers to save them all, and then using his powers to fight their way out of the theater. Like, let's be for real. Let's be for real. I, again, I'm trying not to come off as too judgmental, but on that one, I'm a little judgmental. Um, So then, why didn't Lestat tell Louis the truth when confronted by him and Armand in Magnus's old tower? Well, Louis wouldn't have believed him, for one. Also, there might have been some threat from Armand to Lestat in like a mental conversation. But at the very least, we can say that Louis would not have believed Lestat, uh, because it'd be Lestat's word, the person that Louis thought orchestrated the person that Louis thought orchestrated the trial that killed their daughter, versus Armand's word, the person that Louis thought saved him against all odds. Right? Lestat's word, the person that he had endured so much pain at the hands of, who he thought crossed an ocean, practiced a play that would kill their daughter, versus Armand's word, who had successfully manipulated Louis into thinking that he was more of a victim, that he didn't orchestrate it, that he was forced to play along, and that, against all those odds, still found a way to save. Louis was never going to believe Lestat in that moment. Again, try not to be too judgmental, but on that one, let's be for real. So then we get the Lestat reunion, which is really, it's at the heart of it, it's two parents coming together 77 years later to share grief over the death of their child. The only two people left who knew and loved Claudia, both of them guilty in their own ways of where things went wrong for her, both able to share the happy memories they have of her. Um, it's just an important moment for them to, especially for Louis, to have some sense of healing and moving forward. In addition to the fact that, he lets Lestat know that he's companion for himself, which, oh my gosh, I can't wait to see more of that. I can't wait to see more of Louis comfortable in his skin, in his vampirism, in his queerness. Oh, I can't wait. But then, so in addition to that, we see Louis releasing Lestat from seeing Lestat as like the monster that ruined his life. Um, Releasing Lestat from this perspective of him, of having ruined him by turning him. Louis thanks him for the opportunity that eternal life gave him to get to a place where he can know and love himself and be stronger in being companion enough for himself. But I'm a Lestat shipper. I'm a Louis lover. I'm a Lestat enjoyer. That's where I am on that. And so that's where I end. Well, not in the episode, because then we get the reveal of like Daniel's been Armand turned Daniel, and Daniel's now a vampire. And the other vampires are mad at Louis, and Louis is in his penthouse, which he has redecorated with much more color. He's got more color in his clothes. Place looks more, less like a prison cell. Uh, his clothes are less funeral ready. It gives me a lot of hope. And then he ends the episode with telling the other vampires, run up if you want to. And so yeah, it's so good. It's so good. I love where it ends. Can't wait for more. We got the teaser trailer. If that's something that anybody is interested in me talking about, let me know in the comments. Um, because yeah, I'd love to get into that a little bit. Again, as someone who has watched the show 2 times now and read many of the books, I would like to dig my claws into that analytically. But this has become a very long video, very long video. But I do want to kind of drop a little bit more, a little bit more of my thoughts. So, Lestat versus Armand in the Coven, and that whole conversation that I've seen pop up within fandom. Look, as much control as Armand exerts over the Coven, they did represent a real threat to him. Like season 1 of the show ends with Claudia and Louis getting the jump on Lestat. If Louis hadn't bugged out, they'd have killed him completely. So if those two fledglings could take out their maker, then surely a coven, many of whom's many of the members being older than Claudia and Louis were at the time, could eventually figure out how to take out Armand, right? Meaning that even someone as powerful as Armand could have been defeated if the coven had had enough time to plot against him. Because one thing about vampires and the Vampire Chronicles is that none of them are indestructible, are completely indestructible. Even Akasha, second to her husband Inkle, as the oldest and most powerful of all vampires, she's like literally the mother of vampires, is eventually defeated. So if it could happen to Akasha, it could also happen to Armand. So I think that Armand, again, Armand played it up, weaponized it, but I think Armand did have some reason to be nervous about going against the Coven or the Coven going against him. Absolutely does not excuse what he did to Louis, Claudia, and Madeline, possibly to Lestat to save his own ass. But there was an actual threat there. But I digress. The TDV, the Paris Coven, could have taken Armand down with enough planning, which means they could have taken down Lestat even more easily. Just because he could outsass them doesn't mean that he could have beat them in a fight. Um, the Coven could have beaten Lestat. Armand could have beaten Lestat. So the Coven and Armand together, like at that point, it almost doesn't even matter how the Coven got Lestat to go to Paris in the first place. Once he was there, he was under their thumb. Just like Armand had wanted him to be from the moment he saw him. In my mind, one of like my main theory of how it kind of goes down is that, they get Lestat to Paris. He's full of vigor and, desire for vengeance against Claudia because he still sees her as the main problem in his relationship with Louis. Absolutely refuses to hold himself accountable. Um, to see like how his actions led to things going wrong is fully looking at her as the problem. So, he goes to Paris. He's like, I'm gonna get revenge. Oh no, no. Well, so prior to that, and this is again all my theory. Lestat is in the coffin in the dump, and he's forced to reconcile with his behavior, but he's still trying to fight against it. He's like, no, it wasn't me. It was Claudia. She messed things up. It wouldn't have gone wrong if it wasn't for her. But he's also replaying moments in their history and their time together. So then he gets to Paris, and because sometimes I've experienced this thing where I could have an opinion about something, but if somebody who agrees with me has such an extreme version of that opinion, it kind of makes me change my mind a little bit because it makes me start to second guess, like, am I really, what am I standing for here? What hill am I trying to die on over here? Right? Um, so he gets to Paris, he's like, it's all her fault. And then he sees the extreme and racist way that the Coven is talking about Claudia and how they're planning to treat her in this trial. And he starts to go, wait a minute. Whoa, wait a minute. Maybe it was more my fault than I was ready to recognize, to accept. Maybe I did play, ooh, wait a minute. Maybe I was in the wrong. Oh, maybe I was in the wrong more than I thought. But by the time he gets to Paris, it does not matter. I think he starts to change his mind as he's going along, but it does not matter. Once the Coven, the and Armand, once Armand and the Coven have him, they have him. So they, go forward from there. So anyway, those are my comprehensive thoughts about the show. Are just like the things that really stood out for me. Um, Again, really love the show. I love the characters. I see them all as very complex. For there to be some level of empathy and understanding for them all, except for Bruce, all day for that one. But even Florence, like I can, her being a Creole woman who, by the time we start the show, she's already older. So like what was her life like younger? How did race impact her life? How did her gender impact her life? Um yeah, I think other than Bruce, because even with Santiago, right? Like I could see him building up so much resentment over time, um, that he gets so, he's forced to at some point listen to and feel his maker starved to death in one of those little drawers that they were putting everybody in. And then Claudia and Louis come around, especially Louis, and he gets to kind of do whatever because Armand has feelings for him. So then it's like, okay, well, the only thing that had my maker put through what he was put through and me put through it as, feeling what he was feeling and hearing him scream that drawer was that Armand didn't have feelings for him. Like that's why we went through what we went through, why I was put through what I was put through, because Armand didn't have personally romantic feelings for him. Wow. But Armand had had sex with many of the members, which the way it's played off is oh, it's very like laissez-faire, like everyone doing whatever. And Armand sleeps with this person, that person. He even slept with the father and the son, and da da da. But it's also like Armand holds a lot of power in those situations and those relationships, or he held a lot of power before they all literally went up in flames. Um, shouldn't have been racist. Should have sat there and ate your food. Um, but he, holds a lot of power in those situations, in those relationships. And then he sleeps with some of them while there's still the reality that if he catches them doing, going against the great laws or going against the coven rules, that they too will end up in these drawers or they too will be sent to the flame. I don't know, it's a very messed up dynamic when you really think about it. Um, but Armand went through a messed up dynamic and he's playing those out. So I understand. I have patience. I have love for this character. Santiago, I can even understand where he was coming from. Characters like Florence, I can even understand where they're coming from. I just find them all really fascinating. And I find their stories and the potential of what their stories say about them and about, characters or people like them, um, fascinating. So on that note, if you've watched, thank you so much. If you've made it to the end, please drop, I don't know, that blood drop emoji, drop that in the comments if you made it to the end. But thank you for watching. Thank you for standing for sitting by while Ball Bitch babbles. I had some thoughts. I had to get them off my chest. I'm glad that I'm dead. I'm glad that I'm dead. I'm glad that I did. And later, I think I'm gonna do it. I keep talking. I keep going. I think I'm going to do another video talking specifically about Louis, and I think some of the misunderstanding that people have had of his character, but more reason for me to love on him and talk about how great he is. So if there's, you know, that's possibly coming in the future. If you would like to hear me analyze anyone else or talk about my feelings about anyone else, comments. So final goodbye. I will stop talking. I swear. Bye.